We can talk about FTP.
Sure.
Everyone's
Everyone's
favorite test.
Everyone's favorite test, right?
Well, it is becoming my favorite test.
That's what it stands for. Favorite test.
Interesting,
people.
really.
Or
Yeah.
Why?
Because I stopped doing the 20-minute FTP.
Oh,
so what do you do? Like 1 minute
he
all
does
out?
the RAM test.
I
He
do
does
a
a
ramp
ramp
test. There's an
test.
8-minute FTP, which I don't do, but
Eight
I
minutes?
do a
Don't
ramp
trust
test.
Not
Don't do an
enough,
8
yeah.
minute.
Yeah.
Is
Well,
there-
I can explain the
Yeah,
RAM
let's hear
test.
it.
All right. So
I'm
first we
curious.
have to talk about what FTP is. Okay. Functional threshold power. It's the highest average power you can sustain for approximately an hour. That's measured in watts. What's a watt? 1 watt is 1 joule per second, which
What's a
is
joule?
1 kilowatt
gonna
is
take a
1,000
while.
joules a second. A joule is an electric
Seriously?
the amount of energy, which is what you need to burn a light, something like a light for 1 second. So a 60-watt bulb is burning 60 joules of energy every second when then it's on.
So does that
So
have to do with bike riding?
watts.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
yeah, okay. So common training, it's a common training that we do in cycling uses FTP. And that's what we use to determine our zones when we have a power meter, and I think we all use power meters. And it's training that lactate threshold. It's the highest amount of work your aerobic system can sustain for prolonged effort. Your VO2 max, on the other hand, defines the maximum aerobic capacity or the highest volume of oxygen your body can take in and use. From like a physiological perspective, it's the cycling power you produce when your lactate production is risen or leveled off, and then closely matches your body's ability to remove lactate. This just barely keeps that lactate flooding that we talked about before at bay. In cycling, FTP is a gray area between power you can sustain for a very long time, typically an hour, and the power you can tolerate for a couple of minutes. When you're cycling at low intensities, you're using your aerobic system, using oxygen to metabolize fuel to create the energy needed. And when your aerobic system can meet the energy demands of your muscles, there's less contribution from your anaerobic system. When cycling at higher intensities, the anaerobic system contributes more. Anaerobic system metabolizes fuel sources without oxygen. It creates energy faster, but for shorter periods of time. So when you ride at higher intensities, the byproduct of anaerobic system, they're higher than your ability to clear them out, which is what we talked about before. Breathing goes up, your legs start to burn, which is what we talked about, and your time at this power output is not that long. So usually, now that we can talk about FTP tests, it's a warm-up, and then you do 20 minutes of your best effort where you have to ride as hard as you can, and then you get that number, that high number from whatever you're using, Garmin, Zwift, whatever it is, and you'll have to multiply the average power registered during those 20 minutes by 0.95, which is 95%, and that's your FTP. So what I started doing, which I like a lot better, is the ramp test, and it's gradually increasing resistance to estimate your FTP. You start after the 5-minute warm-up. Every minute after that goes up slightly. Mine goes up about 20 watts until I can't maintain any kind of power in the legs, until my legs just stop. And so that's the ramp test, and it's defined, and it's used to define your limit of your ability to capture the most accurate possible snapshot of how high you can go.
So there's no time limit on it? It's just until you can't
Until you
push
can't
the
pedal
pedals
anymore.
Right. And
Which-
then they usually do, 75% of that last minute average.
So what I like it is because, at least me, when I do that test, I can do something. I can like ride for an hour after if I needed to. Like that test doesn't take me 20 minutes and I'm shot for 2 days. After that 8 minutes, I know what the maximum I can go is, and then I kind of like just spin my legs out.
Yeah, the ramp test is only hard for the last
Like
4 or 5 minutes.
I also find it's not, with the FTP test, pacing is so important because
Yeah.
you pace it wrong.
Yeah.
I've been there.
I think there's
I
something
blow
really-
up and
I think there's something to be said though. Like you need to eventually be you need to be able to pace yourself
True.
as part of your racing strategy, right? Like, so it's a skill that needs practice. Is the 20-minute test the best? I don't know. I do a ramp test too, so I can.
I think after in 2 years, I don't know. You would have to look at it. Sorry, and say what you think, but I think this was the first time I got it right.
Yeah.
Or as close to
From a ramp test?
no, the FTP test to like pacing it correctly.
So that's an interesting point that you just mentioned, that you said you got it right. And that's what I felt every time I did that 20-minute FTP test. Like, I could throw my numbers all over the place. Like, okay, today I'm going to approach, and aside the fact of how rested you are, what activity you did before, it was like, okay, well, I'm going to like try to keep it here for the first 5 minutes. And then I'm going to try to like, I can never average out those 20 minutes. And like you said, there was like a few times where I felt like, oh, I think I actually about got it right. And so that's why the RAM test has been so consistent. And now I'm like, okay, consistently thinking about how to get that number higher in the same. I can't manipulate it in any way. Just
right.
go
And
spin
that's the
it.
thing, because it's
Right.
So, Marilyn, what'd you do differently that you felt like you got it right?
I paid more attention to my heart rate and kind of didn't worry about that watts number that was showing up. Kept my heart rate like around 165. It was funny because we were all chatting and he was saying the same thing. I kept it there, and then with 5 minutes left to go, then I just emptied the tank and just put it all out there. And that's how I think my heart rate at the end was like 170 something, 175.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder, like, the first 15 minutes are not the FTP
I was still,
test? Like, so
I was still going pretty hard, but
so you're still
comfortably
anaerobic
hard.
in your first 15 minutes.
No,
But
you
then
can't be anaerobic for 15 minutes. Like, it's still an
No.
aerobic effort. Like,
Yeah, but it was high
Yeah.
up there.
I don't see. That's why I've been all over the place for a very long time with these 20-minute FTPs,
Right.
and then it also goes like, well, we used to test every like month, and it was like, okay, that's not a thing. So then maybe test like once every 3-4 months, and that kind of got a little bit of a better number, more steady, more kind of like, I feel like this is where I am, and I can put in the next training cycle for the next couple months off that FTP. But doing the RAM test, it's like I've switched and it's like the light's gone on. I'm like, this is what I do.
The way I feel about all these tests, though, I've said it to you guys before. I feel like it's like I cram for a test and I can do well on the test, but then what's retained is not there. And so I can put up a number just for that test. I can mentally suffer on these, whether it's CSS, 5K, FTP, but then reality, I can't use those paces in a race. Like,
So
I will blow up.
if you're a professional like athlete doing this for a living, I would say that those are your numbers. But I agree with you. Like, I would sometimes get an FTP that was so high, and then I would go do some kind of workouts off those FTPs. I'm like, I can't maintain this. I'm hurting
That's
myself.
what's happened to me before, because I think I did the test wrong. Also, I'm the opposite. I don't test well. So I've said I need somebody next to me to race, and then I'll. But that's what I feel like.
So in swimming, you need somebody to just constantly chase and and you just go really
and
fast.
even at the track, the 30-minute all out, I'm like,
30-minute all out is tough because you don't know
It's
when it's going
tough.
to end.
Right.
Like,
You don't
like
know how
30
many
miles,
laps.
but you don't know
Yeah.
how far you have to
Right.
go. I
Yeah.
need to know
where the
stop.
finish line is.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about those tests,
So
Greg?
much.
Well,
Yeah.
well, and concise it down for the listeners to
Okay, so
2 minutes or less.
A little bit of, I can't do that. I'll try though. Okay, so FTP stands for functional threshold power, right? It was developed by two gentlemen, Andy Coggin and Hunter Allen. And they wrote a book called Training and Racing with a Power Meter. Before that, though, they came up with this idea of what's a way we can help cyclists figure out their threshold without coming into a lab once a month to get lactate or VO2 testing, something that they can do on their own. And they came up with this idea of, well, there seems to be this threshold, and you hit on it, and I've only heard it said better. Like, there's one way I've heard it said better that I really like, because it takes their original. If you go back to like the first edition of this book, they say this 60-minute thing. Not everybody's 60 minutes. Your FTP can vary from like 35 minutes up to 70 minutes. Okay. And that's trainable too. So it's not just like yours is 35, Rich, and James, yours is 45. Like if you're at 45, we could do some training, and in 3 weeks it can be 55, you know? So the way to think about FTP is it's a power at which below FTP you can do for an extended period of time. Above FTP, you tire significantly faster. So it's not a linear relationship. Like there's an inflection at that FTP point. If I go if I can hold my FTP for, let's call it 45 minutes. If I go down to 95% of FTP, I can probably hold it for an hour, hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes.
That much of a difference at 95%.
Big difference.
Because you're clearing lactate.
Half Ironman power is like 85% of FTP.
Yeah.
And that's a 2.5 hour race.
No, I get it, but it's because you're clearing lactate.
Yes.
Okay.
Where 105% of FTP, I can do it for like 6 minutes, maybe 7 minutes.
Wow.
Okay.
So when you're testing, you're doing those tests. Yours is so high that when then you go to train, you're still kind of above that particular FTP point that Greg's talking about, and you're like suffering.
So what these guys said with FTP is great number to use in cycling, kind of the gold standard or whatever, is your 40K TT time, 40 kilometer TT, 25 miles. It ends up being around about an hour for a lot of people. Okay, so it ends up being around that kind of that's the word they use now, quasi steady state power.
So if I could do 25 miles in an hour, I'll be happy.
Yeah. What they said then is like, well, one, that'll beat the crap out of you if you try and do it, right? That's a heavy duty effort. But what if we can figure out some relationship between shorter power durations and FTP? And that's where this 20-minute test comes from. Now, the original version, and if you go online and look it up, it should still be out there because this is probably the correct way to do an FTP test. You're supposed to do a 5-minute, at least VO2 effort before the 20-minute effort. You want to use up your anaerobic reserve, kind of like your over-the-top battery. You want to use that up because if you don't, you're using that for the first part of your FTP test,
So
which
you just
is
made
probably
the test
what
much
you're
harder.
How you go out harder.
which is
Right.
probably what you're doing.
Mhm.
And so if you have a pretty large, what's called anaerobic reserve capacity, kind of a battery, and every time you go over FTP, you're tapping into that battery. If yours is bigger, you can use that for more of your FTP test.
Oh, it's definitely bigger.
Okay. So
Pat yourself on the back.
so many jokes to be
I
had.
know.
Right? Right. So if you're, we can't go there. This is a family-friendly podcast. If you're, what you should be doing, if you want to do a shorter test, you should be doing a 30-minute test and only using the last 20-minute average, because then you're going to use that anaerobic reserve early, and your last 20 minutes are valid. Or you use a lower multiplier. That's another way you can do it. My multiplier is not 0.95. I run into the same problem as you do. If I use 0.95, it sets my zones a little too high. It makes a threshold, a tempo effort, a threshold effort.
Yep.
It makes a high endurance effort, a tempo effort. And then I'm not training where I think I am training, and it throws things off.
We had, was it between us that we had a chart that went around that was like based on, I
It
forget
was
what
on
it was
the
based
Facebook
on.
page.
Yeah, I think
forget
so.
who published that
Yeah, and it
article
was
that
based
said like
on-
this 95% number was just like it's an average. Like, yeah, most people 0.95 or so as a multiplier works pretty well, but you have to figure out what your multiplier
Yeah, I
is.
was still 9.5, but it was based on, what was it based on?
You were just using your 20-minute power as your FTP.
I was for a long time, and that was terrible. But that chart, what did it base? I forget what it based it on. If it was weight, I don't know.
Oh, I know. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where FTP comes from. The ramp test tries to do it a different way. To do the ramp test, you definitely need a smart trainer. You need something in erg mode that can control that power output.
It sounds more repeatable.
Yes.
Yes.
It's also, and one of the things I want to stress that you guys kind of all hit on was like not doing well on tests or failing it. You can't think of, and that's what has happened with FTP. It's turned into, I wish I had the bleep button, but a dick measuring contest to have the biggest number you can have and like show it off to all your friends and be like, "Here are my FTPs."
That's not what I mean when I say I didn't do well.
No, I understand
I
what
mean,
you're
like
doing.
when I blew up because I went out at 200 watts and,
then you
and I
can't
couldn't
finish.
finish it.
But like
So-
people have this idea that they can pass. You can't pass or fail an FTP test,
Right.
right? You learn something from every test that you take, and hopefully what you learn is where that steady state, level or threshold exists for you. But really, like, I always think you should hedge your bet lower. If you think like your calculations tell you that it's, whatever, pick a number, 250, and that's the number, 250.45, that's what the calculator spits out, then like do it 245. Like, it's much better because of the way that power duration curve works. It's much better to go 5 or 10 watts lower than 5 or 10 watts too high. Right. You're going to set yourself up for a really tough time if you set it too high. So set it a little bit lower, make those workouts a little more achievable, and just like don't see it as a test that like you're not going to go shout your FTP on the top of a mountain and be like, look at me. Like, no,
What was that like? Well,
there's no pro cyclist in the
James?
world who is going to tell you what their FTP is. Right? No pro cyclist in the world is going to tell you what their FTP is. That's
No.
like a highly guarded secret for them. Like,
Yeah.
so who cares what your FTP is? Your FTP is where you're at. Try and see some improvement if that's what you're trying to improve in your cycling.
so that's interesting. There's a couple of things. Well, I was listening to a podcast where somebody was saying that they were paying attention to the pros Strava and trying to figure out their FTP numbers
my
from there.
God,
So that
really?
was interesting. But another metric that people use is power to weight ratio. So it's your power output in watts, and using the kilograms. So and then you're divided by your weight in kilograms. So that's another way of kind of having a good measure. Now, in the thing about doing that 20-minute FTP test, in terms of statistics, like probably if you take 30 or 40 FTP tests over the years and you average them, then maybe you can get some kind of like some data out of that. I feel like that one-time FTP, that result is almost like it needs to be repeatable. You know how like an experiment needs to be repeatable? And I just don't feel like that 20-minute FTP is as repeatable as the ramp test, because as repeating the ramp test, it's coming out very consistent. And, and like as a data guy, I like that.
The only
Consistency
thing with
and
the ramp test is
repeatability.
the same thing as James would probably destroy a ramp test because if your anaerobic reserve is that high, the test is so
It's
short,
more
you're not
anaerobic.
using it up until the very end. You might get really high numbers.
I'm curious now.
But
I
you can
did-
go do like a 10-minute ride and then do that ramp test.
You could do like a
I don't know if
blowout
it was-
beforehand.
Like
Yeah, I don't know if
sprint.
Greg said it
God,
or
so
I
many
read
jokes.
it, but it depends on how you physiologically, I can never say that word, how you run.
Yeah.
Some people
Yeah.
perform better at one than at others.
Right.
Than at the FTP, or they perform better at the ramp.
If you are
Depends how your body
average
works.
from a physiological standpoint, not your number, you could have a 500 watt FTP. I'm talking like the ratio of anaerobic to aerobic kind of stuff. Both of those all your tests will probably work. I would tell you to test it out. I don't know if it was last year or the year before. I did a ramp test on one day, got a number. 2 days later,
I wanted to do that, but
I
never.
went and climbed Alpe d'Huez, which is
boy.
pretty much an hour-long
Yeah.
effort, and I said, I'm going to go as hard as I can. The number the ramp test spit out and my average power for Alpe d'Huez, 2 watts different. So what does that mean?
Either test. is fine.
I'm in the middle of a bell curve, right? That I don't have some outlandish anaerobic capacity. I don't have some huge aerobic engine that's dwarfed by that. Or like I'm an average power curve for a cyclist.
Did you know your ramp result before you did your Alpe d'Huez?
Yeah, you did it 2 days
Yeah, he
before.
did it before.
I did. So you're right. There's that possibility. But I will tell you, I didn't really pay attention to my power because I was trying to beat a certain time on Alpe d'Huez. So I was literally
Touché.
just trying to go as fast
But
as I
isn't
could.
that the same thing?
No, because I didn't know what power would get me that time.
You don't really, especially on an uphill, you don't know.
But you knew
technically your
that
power till the end.
as you were getting closer to that hour and your distance remaining, that you needed to go harder.
But honestly, like if I went that much harder, I would have thrown up on my shoes. Like I was maxed out. Like I went as hard as I could, and I didn't have like if you look at my power file, it was pretty darn flat. Yeah, there was like the last 30 seconds I stood up and could sprint, But if that 30 seconds changed my average by a watt, 2 watts, like it got me to a good number. It
Now-
gave me my functional threshold.
Can we just avoid all the FTP tests if you just do a blood lactate test? Like you just did
yeah.
like some effort on a bike,
But
measure,
that-
and
I
keep
did.
measuring.
I've started doing that. And so what I do 2 different lactate tests. I do a ramp test to find that first lactate threshold, and that's a sub-max effort. That's only going up until I see that first inflection point. And then I go like one or
Using
two
a lactate meter.
using my lactate meter. I go 1 or 2 steps higher to make sure it wasn't like an anomaly and it's actually still going up. I do that. Then I do something called maximum lactate steady state. And that's kind of like an FTP test, but MLSS is usually a little bit lower than what your FTP would test at, okay? And what I do is I warm up for 20 or 30 minutes, and then I pick a power that I think is pretty close to what this number is based on prior test data. And I do a 10-minute effort there, and I take a lactate test at 4 minutes and at 10 minutes. And if the number hasn't risen by more than 1
Millimole?
millimole, right? If it has, so if like I get to that first number and it's 3.2 at 4 minutes and 3.6, then I go up another 10 watts and I do another 10-minute test. And I'm looking for the point where it goes up by more than 1 millimole. And what that means is I'm not able to clear that lactate. I'm
Second
producing it,
inflection point.
right? I'm seeing that. So then I set that, and I use that number as my threshold. Now that last year when I first got the lactate meter, I did this for the first time. That MLSS was like 25 watts less than my FTP.
Is that what you feel was more appropriate?
So when I set my zones based off that lower number, my zones felt more like
Training.
I felt like they should feel.
So what's okay. So then tell our listeners what your goal is in doing those tests over
So
your training and your racing.
because then I see what those numbers are, and it becomes much easier now to spot check it because if I know, okay, at 255 watts, I was producing 3.4 millimoles of lactate, then I can go do a 10-minute effort at that and check my lactate. And if I'm at 2.9, I got fitter, right? And now I can, okay, now let's go back up and do another test, but now I can move it up a little bit. So it gives me a little bit of a better idea of where those, excuse me, a little burpy. It's the seltzer.
It's a little seltzer in here.
It gives me just a little bit better of an idea of, I think, where the physiological things are. And it takes there's not the, like when you're doing an FTP test, like I got to get amped up and
Yeah,
ready to
it's
like I have to be motivated
mentally,
to,
it's really hard mentally.
yeah. So like with this, I don't need to do that.
How often do you do it?
It depends on what part of my power curve I'm working on, right? So now I'm not doing a whole lot. I'm just started doing a little bit of tempo work. So I did it a couple of weeks ago to get an idea where I was at, and then in a couple of weeks I'll test again if I start to see what I think is improvement. Prior to that, I wasn't really doing it because I was working on the low end of the aerobic stuff. So I was doing some of those low end aerobic ramp tests, and then like I'd be sitting there at 170 watts, and I'd be like, oh, let's prick my finger and see what number I get, and make sure I'm doing okay. And then like the next week, I tried at 180 watts and see.
So I just kind of want to say that that's all wonderful stuff, and I'm really into it, and that's great.
That's not something the average person is going to be doing.
Yeah, so I just kind of want to bring it back to that number I used earlier to maybe give people a better understanding is that power to weight ratio. So over time, over racing season, over whatever you want to use, I use the gauge of power to weight ratio. So like I want that ratio, I want that to increase as I get into the races, and that's what I'm looking to improve on. And I don't do the test that you said because I think that's very interesting. And if I could, I would and get all that data, and it's all great stuff. But maybe a lot of our listeners can just do the, over time, how has my power to weight ratio changed?
And I think there's metrics out there that you can use that you don't have to test all the time.
Yeah.
Looking at what your power is for a given heart rate. It doesn't have to always be an all-out FTP test. Like if you're working on tempo work for a block, then you should see that either your power at that same heart rate starts going up as if your training's working, or if it doesn't, like you have to look at what you're doing. Are you pushing yourself enough to be getting the stimulus that you need? Like, it doesn't have to be an FTP test. I guess what I've gotten to at this point in my athletic kind of journey is anchoring everything to one metric doesn't work. I think you have to look at stuff across a more broad spectrum. And I think that's what we're doing a good job of talking about all that different stuff here. Yep. FTP is one number, but people have been destroyed and ruined their seasons by focusing on that one thing. How high can I get my FTP? How big can that number be at the end of a 20-minute test? Unless you're racing, I don't know, 10-mile TTs in England, which is like a big thing they do, I don't know that FTP needs to be your sole focus, and too many people hone in and focus on that one thing.
Other things to focus on, and I think that it should be a part of everyone's workout as they are going through their journey, is when you go out there to do a kind of a workout or a test or whatever it is, or a ride outside, what you want to focus on is one thing. So you can go out there and focus on hammering the hills. That's something that'll improve you as a cyclist. You can go out there and focus on cadence, which I think is a very big thing that we didn't really touch on because we were talking about FTP. But that's, cadence is a very important thing when you're racing and cycling. So you want to focus on something like that. And then maybe you want to go out and focus on heart rate. So there's a lot of metrics to use when you're out there and what you can focus on. And the FTP also has zones, and you can look up some basic charts, which I've looked up, where they have about 5 or 6 zones, and it shows what your heart rate is at each zone. We talked about them in running, and what your power is going to be and how long you can hold it. And it goes from basically like that warm-up recovery or to your endurance pace, your tempo pace, your threshold pace, your VO2 max, and then your anaerobic capacity and what your intensities are at each one of those zones. And that's how your training should go once you've determined your FTP.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, I think you just have to kind of keep track of all of it. Like, and that seems like it's a lot. Maybe that's not what I mean by keep track of all of it. I think you need to be aware of all of it. I think you can't hone in on just one thing. Power meters came out and became popular in probably the early 2000s, and everybody who got one was just like, well, I can throw away my heart rate strap. I don't have to worry about anything. Just power, power, power. And before that, it was heart rate, heart rate, heart rate. And like, you need to kind of have a big 10,000-foot view of all that data and see how it all fits together. Like, I'm constantly paying attention to what's my power at a given heart rate, what's my pace when I'm running, or my power when I'm running at a given heart rate. What's the perceived exertion at those heart rates? Like this morning I was running.
But you focus on one thing during that one particular period, or you focus on 10 different things?
It's probably not 10 different things, but like I do like to anchor, because they're all sort of measuring something different, right? Like power is an external load that you're placing on your muscles. Your heart rate is your body's response to that load. So it's almost like how fast are you going versus what your RPMs on your tack in your car going. Like you need to balance. Like
It's a sweet spot.
Yeah, I'm going to be worried if I'm going 40 miles an hour, but my car says it's doing 4,000 RPMs. Like if I was only looking at power, if I was only looking at speed, I'm like, oh, cool, I'm doing 20 miles an hour when I want to do 20 miles an hour. But what if that tack is pegged? Like there's something wrong there. You need to have all those kind of things in mind. I was running this morning, and like I said, I warmed up in zone 1. I didn't mean to warm up in zone 1. It's like, but why isn't my heart rate coming up? Like, and I'm thinking about it as I'm going. I'm like, well,
it's good.
Is it good? Is it just
HRV
super early? Is it I'm not woken up yet? The caffeine hasn't kicked it. Like like there's something.
You're just
it's
fit.
not just not fitness.
Yeah.
So it's like I kind of
I'm going with
paying
HRV.
attention. I'm paying attention to all those things.
But if for the people who are out there and listening, there's a lot of data. You can definitely start using it. Try to kind of stay away from all of the too muchness out there and try to find some kind of basic nomenclature and basic zones that you use, and try to stick to that and learn that before you go deep into taking lactate tests and measuring inflection curves.
I think you need to, what did you just say? Shit.
Nomenclature?
No, he did say nomenclature.
Did you really?
I think you need to find like one or two things to really pay attention to, and then just learn those things. Like heart rate is a great spot to start. Heart rate could be your end game also. Like I think heart rate's been poo-pooed over the years because power data. I think heart rate is a really great metric to use. I think power is a really great metric to use. I think lactate is probably pointless for most people out there. There's a lot of stuff that you can use. I think you need to pick one or two things. I think there was a podcast I used to listen to. It was a swimming podcast. But the guy gave a great way of trying to explain what you should be thinking about. And it was like, you need to associate a feeling with a pace and like an effort. Like you need to know that like, okay, 70% effort feels like this. And that 70% effort that feels like this associates with this pace. And like the better you get at that, the more dialed, all this data is trying to do is put numbers to what's going on in your body. Like you need to feel that. You need to know what that effort feels like and what it correlates to, because then that'll let you know when it's improving. And like the better in touch you are with what's going on as you exercise, the better you're going to be at adjusting those things on the fly when you need to.
Yeah, I think the same way of saying it is like you need to figure out what gear 1 is, gear 2 is, gear 3 is, gear 4 is, as part of your engine. And in gear 1, my heart rate's like this, my cadence is this, my whatever VO2 is this, and then as you know it, and as you get better at knowing what gear 1, gear 2, gear 3 is, those metrics kind of become second nature, and you can pay attention to them differently and depending on the gear you're in and what you're looking to do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that was it for episode 1 of this. Is that a good spot to stop, guys?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a break here. And next week, we're going to come back with part 2 of this, where we dive into some of the more kind of, I don't want to say minutia, but like some of the things that maybe you hadn't thought about tracking and thinking about when it comes to exercising and figuring out your plan. So thanks, everybody, for listening. Please subscribe, hit that like button, leave a comment. Tell your friends about it. That'd probably be the best thing you could do right now is
And
tell
we're on
somebody you know.
TikTok.
We're on TikTok. We're on
TikTok.
Instagram. Where all the hip kids hang out. And we'll catch you next time with part 2 of our deep dive into data. Thanks for listening, everybody.